You're judging me. You've actually started to identify whether I'm going to be worth the next 20 minutes of your life or not. You've looked at maybe my Finland dress clothes. You maybe looked at my age. You maybe looked at my behavior on stage. You started to identify and categorize little bits and pieces of what's going to make you decide if this is a royal waste of your time and if Petra should get an email afterwards. So what I'm going to do with you today is ask you not to be the son of a bitch. Please and thank you. So we're going to talk about identity today in a lot of other ways. What you've done to me is actually totally natural. It's a human process that most people do each and every day. And what we've done with the web is just transform that. We've changed and we've uploaded ourselves to the cloud. All the little pieces of us, whether we're posting a selfie, doing a video, writing a comment, we've decided to share little pieces of who we are, or our likes, or our affiliations. And it's interesting because we've done this in a chaotic, messy fashion. And it's kind of scary to think about because back in the day in this little room, we could be a village. We can know and recognize each other just by walking enough around to know that who's that person over there? You're late, it's okay, just come. He looks not risky. He doesn't look like he's going to harm me. But how do you do that when you're doing that in a digital form? And where has that led us to? So today I'm going to talk to you about a few things. We're going to try to cover in about 20 minutes 3 things. I'm going to try to identify and explain the state of the digital identity landscape. And we're going to start by talking about what's not working, because it's a freaking mess right now, frankly. And then we're going to talk about the things that I've been privileged to see and why they're leading to problems or potential solutions. And then the third but not least, I'm going to give you a Hail Mary, hallelujah. Maybe there's a solution where you can take home to your organization or to the way you do identity in your daily life. So there's actually 400% more breaches this year already than there was last year. I can go on and do a whole keynote on Cambridge Analytica and the fact that Equifax was a massive breach in the US, and I've been privileged to work with them, or misfortune, depends how you look at it. The fundamental thing that identity needs to solve for all of us not to be sons of a breaches is really the trust and reputational issue of what you're putting out there. So why is this stuff a problem? Well, if matters weren't worse already, there's about 1 billion of us out there without an identity. I worked in the UN Identity for Africa project. And what it means to have no identity doesn't mean that they're not human beings just like I am standing in front of you. It just means that they don't have a way that the system has found to categorize them, to be able to even let them in. What that means is they're subjective to things like being paid in cash in unconceivable terms to a Finnish society, for sure. There's about 161 countries that in this race to define identity, like you were trying to define and categorize me, have put digital identity systems in place. I've been privileged to work with the Nordics and see that you guys led in the way of putting a number. However, how does that number or that identification system connect to anything else outside of the Nordics? How does it correspond? As an example, I did a project actually in Ireland, and they used facial recognition. And the photo booths of facial recognition were really great, and it was easy, and it was an accolade, just like Estonia is sort of the honey for identity in some countries. The funny thing is that a lot of Irish people immigrate to the UK, and when they got to the UK, they got to the passport office, and guess what? The photo booths are different. The technology is different. So those identity systems are despair, and it actually didn't work. So then what we also did as an industry, we said, okay, well, let's put devices into this equation. Let's put 600 billion devices that are used every day on biometrics. And you want to know the funny thing about it is there's no regulation like a GDPR in devices. There's all this data being produced out there that are things that are now being used to identify you, connect you. One of my favorite examples is Alexa. In the States, there was a 6-year-old that used her voice recognition, which is a biometric, which is a device that her mom owns, and ordered 6 pounds of sugar cookies. Because even though Alexa understood the command, it didn't understand the identity or the person behind the command. And now there's about 700 million e-passports in circulation. So what that means is that not only there's disparate systems within the countries, because normally most identity schemes are not connected totally to your passport. The US, Canada, the UK, none of them are totally connected to your passport. So when people ask me, what do I think about identity? I think identity is a market. I think it's undeniable, undisputable, that if you're all consumers in this marketplace, identity is going to be a market. And that privacy is a right that most of us, honestly, have forgotten about, or don't even really know how to define it. I often have this conversation with my friends. And my best friend, his name is John, he has a 2-year-old. And I swear to God, that kid's entire digital identity and every sneeze he has is on social media somewhere. And my friend is really excited because he's bored out of his mind with a 2-year-old, and he gets the likes. And the likes make him identify like he has a tribe that cares for him, which is, again, another basic human need. But what does that mean when it comes to ethics? So let's talk about the basics, and I'm going to get a little bit of technical on a few things. So when I think about identity, identity is an array of things, just like we started our exercise today of you trying to identify me. You can identify me by something called your physiology. So that can be part of your biometrics, but just your genetics. There's actual countries, and there's an experiment in Japan right now where they're using identity schemes, they're using genes to map humans, and to say that that is going to be the ultimate identification schema that will survive. There's behavior. So if you notice, I'm Brazilian, I talk with my hands, I move around, I don't stand still. You can actually now, using accelerometers in most phones and most actually connected devices, as a way of identifying me. You can continuously get the information about how I behave, what I behave. Does that mean that that's my identity? There's your belonging and association. I just talked about it. Ireland, your government. If you're like me, you have one too many passports. And who do I really belong to? Well, it's funny because you look at history, and identity started by monarchies being able to enforce the fact that you belong to that cult, or it was actually done for a risk measure. And then there's the beloved, it's something you know, something you have. Something you know, there's an entire industry built on it, KYC and personal verified questions. What's your favorite movie? What's your dog's name? We've all seen it. Passwords are the easiest thing to forget, and we are fundamentally lazy. But somehow, we've said that that's identity. Or something you have. If you're like me again, you lose stuff. I lose stuff. I don't lose my phone now as much. I have done it in the past. But is that really what defines me? Or there's the digital you, which a lot of people went on about, and one of my mentors, David Birch, talked about the fact that the digital you could be a dog on the internet. It's funny, though, because when you look at human behavior, and I'm an actuarian by trade, and you look at the data, why is your photo on LinkedIn fundamentally different than your photo on Facebook? Why do you obsess about one or the other? Is that an expression of who you are, or are you consciously thinking about what people are going to perceive you at? So could that mean that identity is more than just a way of authenticating you, but is actually a way of permissioning you to belong somewhere? So the average person has about 21 identities. And I actually, funny exercise, if you're a bit of a geek, walk outside of here and count how many identities you have. How many times you're actually identifying yourself with a different piece of data. A different flyer number that leads nowhere, which is a whole other topic. But what are you using to do that? And why have we as a society looked at technology and forgotten that there's actually just one human being? So let's talk about the basics. I talked about this with you, and let me explain to you in the industry about the problem. I've been fortunate to work with about 40 banks, 6 technology companies, and 7 governments so far. And when you look at this, why is it a problem that we're using these identity measures as either static, asynchronous pieces of data, or we're thinking that once we've captured them, we're good. I've done my KYC, I'm good. That assumes you don't fundamentally change. And you've all fundamentally changed it or added more data at a faster speed than we've ever as a humanity, created anything. We are creating more data than anything we've ever built. So when you think about this, your physiology. So for those of you who don't know or understand the biometric market, there is something called FIDO. It's the closest thing we as a humanity have come to a standard. The fallacy in it is very simple. Who here uses their biometrics on their phone to authenticate? By a raise of hands. Most of you. Do you know that actually your bank or your service provider has no idea it's you? And the reason for that is if your wife or your kids or your husband or your significant other has fingerprints on your phone, all that the provider gets back is a token saying yes, it matches what was on the device, or no, it doesn't. They don't actually know if it's your face or if it's your finger. So how safe is that if you're now doing perhaps more than just logging into your bank account? And who has the right to have that information? So this is what FIDO said. FIDO said that all the identities should stay on device. That's nowhere near a standard. Or your behavior, contextual information. The interesting thing about this when you look at your identity scheme is that some companies will say to me, but Bianca, I'm doing something really great. I'm actually implement context and behavioral biometrics as a way of authenticating my user. I say, great. How is your risk parameter set? Usually most systems will have an input to say, I can take on your behavior, but I can't react to it. It's like doing automation and not having a better pricing strategy. What are you going to do with the data? You can't do anything with it. And you talk about your belonging or something you know. We can talk about the dark web for ages, and the fact that if you don't believe data is a market, go look at how much money people are making on you every day. It's scary, and they have no ethics, no regulation. They don't do committees. They don't book meetings. They just do stuff. And you're at a mercy of that. Or my favorite about something you have, which most of the industry standards and pinnacles, especially with cryptocurrency right now, is let's have tokens and keys. And hey, I'm all for asymmetric cryptography. But telling me I have to carry something that's about this big with keys on sets of keys to protect something as basic as what it feels like my login, you're never going to get adoption. Human beings are inherently lazy. Tell me right now that you don't repeat at least one of your passwords. Lies. We all do it. And when I think about the digital you and the disaster that we're seeing with Facebook, I think fundamentally we should all be ashamed in this industry that we've done a piss poor job at best at educating our consumers of what are you giving for what are you getting. What is that equation? Don't believe me. Think about the ad duopoly in the world. They've found a way of monetizing your data. They've found a way of monetizing all the little pieces of the digital you. You just happen not to be a part in that market. You don't get a piece of the pie. I tell my friend, John, I'm like, do you know that Facebook makes on you about $60 on all your kids' photos? Well, how much of that are you getting? Would you pay for it? So how ready are you for this market, for this change, for this understanding of what identity is supposed to mean? If you're not ready, the market is ready. It's a multi-billion-dollar market growing at a ridiculous pace. And companies are spending 60% of their budget trying to understand this. And if you don't think about it, you need to think about the fact that your organization needs to put humans first. It's actually a way you do technology. It's not about just the cool onboarding experience or the flashy new app. If you don't understand the path of data and the data points you're gathering for that identity of that human, you won't be able to serve them. You won't be able to understand them in the future. So is it all lost and terrifying? No, not too much. So this is my 2 cents for what I've seen work, or what I've seen the shift, the mental, fundamental shift that needs to happen. You need to rethink of identity as a service. You need to rethink of identity as a way of creating value, not as a static dance and song of compliance. It's an opportunity to actually decentralize your systems and turn some of your compliance regulatory mandates into a potential P&L, if you think about it differently. In order to do that, you need to first educate and change the vernacular inside of your teams. If I did a survey right now of this room, every single one of you likely would give me a different answer for what is identity. Some of you might say that it's what makes me special. Or some of you might say that it's your biometrics or whatever. Just that exercise that we went through alone. Which one are you capturing? Which one is static? Which one do you capture once and never look at it again? And how do you think about this as a business model? So when I think about it, the biggest thing that I think is a misconception is that identity is who you are. Identity is permission. Pieces of your identity are what permission you. And I'll give you an example that's plain and simple. My best friend, I often give him my car keys if he wants to go for a ride. When he shows up drunk, I don't give him my car keys. His identity didn't change. His context changed it. His situational state at that point, maybe physiological changed. How are we capturing that change, and how are we rethinking that identity is permission and access? It's what you're permission and entitled to do at that given time. And that's how we got in this fallacy of losing what privacy is supposed to be. And that's always iterative. It's always changing. So if you're not understanding or rethinking how you're going to capture data and all the things about me that are changing in your organization, you are going to miss the train. And when you think about it, not almost all transactions, when you actually boil down to it, almost all transactions don't need identity. It's funny that I find that we've spent bazillions of dollars on building a card, a debit card or a credit card. And we put this really fancy called token technology on it. And for some reason, this technology is really all we need. We go in, we tap, or we insert on a machine, or we use our phones, and we get out. Neither us nor the clerk really cares about what our name is or what our signature looks like in the back. But somehow we've made it really simple for all the robbers out there. We put our names on the card. You don't need to know what your name is. Neither does the clerk. The only person who fundamentally needs to know, so you made it really easy for them, is the robber. So let's put it raised in case they're in a hurry, so they can actually copy it really quick with carbon. When you think about it, all transactions don't need identity. They need permissioning. You walking into a bar, they don't need to know where you live. They don't actually have the right to know that information. They just need to know you're allowed to be in there based on the one rule that they can get their ass kicked for, which is, are you of age? When you rethink that, you rethink the steps of building a system. You think of identity as data, and you think of a continuous model. So let me walk you through the slide. So you first start by really understanding the permissioning decision. So for the first time ever, privacy actually has a regulation. GDPR is in effect in less than a month. So how are you going to understand what you're capturing and what your permissioning levels are? It can no longer be static. And then how are you going to validate that continuously? How's your system built? Or better yet, your operations built, so this isn't a cumbersome, massive intake. This is where automation is a beauty. It should actually happen. It should be asynchronous all the time. And then how do you move that to a contextual decisioning? Just like don't need to identify John all the time. My best friend, I know who he is. I don't need to ask him a personal verified question. I maybe just need to contextually change the fact that today he's drunk, yesterday he wasn't. And then how do I, over time, change how we build and think of risk? How do we change the way that identity is actually structured? And how do we not become servants to this market that's moving at a faster pace with bigger budgets than you'll ever have? They don't play by the same rules. So what I caution you to do or think that's super important, and I see it, is rethink your entire technology stack. Stop telling me, if you don't educate your team, every time I walk into a bank, this is a funny exercise at this point, or a large organization, I look under the hood, and between mainframe, some Cobalt, and some other stuff, and DOS still, I ask who owns identity, who owns authentication, and I get about 5 or 6 raise of hands. At that moment, I already know that if I'm in a senior room, they don't have an identity strategy. They don't understand, because thinking your technology stack and saying I'm doing something cool in authentication on an SDK, it's not rethinking your identity strategy. It's not rethinking the opportunity to decentralize this and actually have a new revenue model. Think about who you will trust with this stuff. And if you're in bank and financial systems, I often say this. Banks have historically been what? The discretionary and risk managers for you. You've trusted them with something you could understand, which was this thing called money that you worked really hard for. Who are you going to trust with you? And all that is that digital you. Who will be the discretionary manager of your data and your trust? Thank you.